And so with that, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, someone who is an information omnivore, Renee DiResta, the head of policy for data and democracy and a Mozilla fellow in media, misinformation, and trust. Take it away, Renee.
I'm going to plug in here. Thank you all for coming tonight. So I'm Renee DiResta, head of policy at Data for Democracy and a Mozilla fellow in media, misinformation, and trust. What this means is that I've spent the last couple of years looking at the problem of disinformation across multiple types of actors and multiple types of systems. And what I am here to talk to you about today is thinking about elections in this context. So disinformation isn't actually limited to elections. It's an issue that often is something that develops over time. And so I'm going to start by framing it in this particular capacity in ways that we rely on people to be informed in the pushback against misinformation, particularly in the era of technological systems that make it very easy to reach people to spread false narratives. So we are starting with 2016. So post-truth was named the 2016 Word of the Year by Oxford Dictionaries. You know, other things in the running probably were alternative facts and a couple of other choice phrases that basically highlight for us the fact that in 2016 in particular we saw a phenomenal amount of false information displayed across all types of media. And so I think it helps to define the term. You know, post-truth is a great term because it encompasses the environment in which disinformation, misinformation, and hoaxes have become prevalent. But disinformation, misinformation, and hoaxes are actually three different things. So as Sarah was discussing, the notion of misinformation, initially, when you have a situation like an earthquake, you'll have somebody who will tweet something or post something that's simply incorrect. They got it wrong. This is the kind of thing journalists do this. Also, you see it, the sort of fog of war problem. Information in a breaking, evolving, tumultuous environment is sometimes simply wrong. And misinformation lends itself to be corrected by fact checkers because it's usually both created by and spread by people who have really good intentions. This is very different than disinformation, which is a term that we use and that I'm going to use sort of throughout to talk about deliberate attempts to seed false narratives or to make people believe an incorrect thing. And that's because disinformation is usually something that's spread by one group that is targeting another group with the intent of making them believe something that's either not factually accurate or is highly provocative or highly swaying, or to spread a narrative that's particularly divisive. And propaganda is sort of a tactic in a disinformation campaign in an information war. So that's the sort of hierarchy that we use when we think about this stuff. Propaganda just means information with an agenda. So it is something that can be spread by governments, but it can also be spread by corporations or by people. Propaganda in a disinformation campaign is content that's put out to make people believe a particular thing. So all of these have been sort of rolled up under the name fake news. And the environment that we're in now, the sort of post-truth era, is also coming to encompass an era in which fake audio and manipulated video are kind of coming into their own. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why this is and how we got there. So there are structural issues and then there are geopolitical issues. And so I'm going to touch on both. So social networks in particular have made it very easy to reach vast numbers of people incredibly easily. And that's because the thing that makes them so powerful is that they connect us. And any propagandist needs an audience in much the same way that any advertiser needs an audience, which is why if you build a system that connects large numbers of people, particularly, and makes them reachable and accessible, unfortunately you've also created a tool that's extremely appealing to propagandists and bad actors. So this is the problem of misuse. Since everyone is connected on the internet and everyone is very, very frequently on the internet, I noticed there weren't a lot of folks on Twitter here. But in general, you know, Facebook is a great connector. People spend a lot of time on YouTube getting social in the channels. If you're a gamer, there's Discord and Twitch. I mean, there's an entire ecosystem of platforms by which people can connect. So this means that there are also captive audiences to be found everywhere because these are kind of standing communities. And so this means that whether it's a Twitter hashtag or a Reddit, you know, subreddit community or a Facebook page or a Facebook group, these are environments where people tend to connect a little bit more permanently in the digital era. So we should all be aware by now that social network activity does shape opinions, and as a result of the way that people are exposed to information, as Sarah pointed out, it does help to solidify or inform opinions. The net kind of result of this is that the real world implications as those opinions are shaped are that people can begin to have particular perceptions of certain policies, for example. And then unfortunately, as we see in extreme cases, it actually has the potential to destabilize democracy. Democracy is dependent on an informed electorate, and if the electorate is receiving vast quantities of misinformation or hate speech or what we see sometimes in parts of the world that are not the US, ethnically divisive speech, these are the sorts of areas where those societal fractures can actually negatively impact the way that people engage with their neighbors. So the power to influence opinions increasingly lies with those who can most widely and effectively disseminate a message. And we used to say that we're in an era in which people are connected on platforms that make advertising very easy. Everything has become kind of a marketing campaign. I did a lot of work on SB 277, which was the vaccine law, and we ran ads on Facebook, and we kind of grew a grassroots group on Facebook. And so it's a phenomenal tool for activism. And that's because social networks have been designed specifically to facilitate sharing. So if I can reach a collection of people who are interested in my particular point of view about something, in this case it was a vaccine law, they likely have friends who are sort of sympathetic to my point of view also, and so they will organically take the content that I'm putting out to them, and then they in turn will spread it to their network. So the distribution, the platforms are designed to facilitate the sharing because it benefits them for a number of reasons. Some of it is in terms of engagement. They keep their own user base active and happy and engaged. They feel they're seeing compelling content that's interesting to them. It also benefits advertisers, which is how they make their money. And so it's this kind of 1-2 punch that says that it's both more enjoyable for the user to have these tools to facilitate rapid sharing, and it's also better for the advertisers because it helps they're charged less when their content reaches more people through organic spread as opposed to simply paying to reach each person. So this is where the notion of paid ads is one small piece of it, but organic content and the way that we share information is actually the really critical thing to be talking about here, particularly when we think about the fact that what this means is that the power to influence opinions lies with the group that's most adept at getting the message out, even if they're very, very small. So when SAM was introduced, I believe the concept of manufactured consensus was mentioned. And so one of the challenges when we think about how information spreads around social ecosystems is that bad actors who have a lot of fake accounts can masquerade as real people. And so that is how either very, very small groups of people or small groups of fake people can actually have serious reach. Their information can get out there and reach real people who then in turn spread it to their communities. And so this is how the problem begins to propagate and why ideas about information integrity are kind of the core to our discussions, particularly as we think about the information environment in the election season that we're moving into. So bots and automated accounts on Twitter, for example, can be programmed to repeat inaccurate or incendiary talking points. Sarah mentioned the notion of hashtag spamming, where people are pushing an unrelated message into a hashtag. You'll also see people pushing, in the tragic cases of mass shootings, this happens very often. People will name people who are not actually the shooter, but unfortunately, by the time that information is corrected, the poor person who was misidentified finds themselves the recipient of having their entire internet life assessed and analyzed and pushed out to the masses. You'll see it returned, unfortunately, in search results if search is taking too great a signal from social chatter. So this is an example of how, unfortunately, influence and disinformation dissemination are systemic. Things hop from platform to platform to platform. And so if, what we say a lot of the time when we talk about Sam's issue of manufactured consensus, if you can make it trend, you make it true. Because unfortunately, for certain moments in time, if I go and search for the name of, of someone involved in a mass shooting, for example, the results that are going to be returned to me are going to confirm that initial fraudulent misconception, and it's going to take a while for the internet to kind of catch up and fix that problem. So this is the problem of what is popular or what is rapidly shared or what is incendiary. Incendiary content is much more likely to be reshared. People really respond to righteous indignation, to rage. There are a couple of interesting studies that say that a lot of the most popular articles that get tweeted around a lot and shared a lot are also the ones that are like really not the ones that are most widely read. Like they're not actually reading the content, they're reading the headline and then hitting the share button. And so this is how the problem of popularity for a long time has resulted in, this was the problem of clickbait, that social platforms really had to get in there and try to create signals by which they took into account whether or not the person sharing the content had actually read the article before deciding to share. In the era of what we call zero-cost publishing, anyone can write whatever they want. So nailing the distribution channel is often a lot more important than actually being factually accurate, because if you can make it trend, you can make it true. So if you can create content that people are going to find really appealing, that's going to have that one sentence about your message, that one kind of core piece to the propaganda, you can get it out there if you game the system well enough. There are no gatekeepers really that fact check. You know, we have kind of democratized access to dissemination channels, and while that has had wonderful positive benefits in terms of opening up people who didn't previously have a reach or have a voice and helping them find an audience, the flip side of that has been that there is no editorial oversight, no fact checking. And so the kind of stuff that wouldn't make it to the front page of your newspaper can in fact make it front and center and be shared by hundreds of thousands of people on a social platform. So I'll talk really briefly about election 2016. So I was one of the people who did the research on looking at the tracking the Russian content from platform to platform to platform. And this was during a period in early 2016 when the social platforms themselves didn't really have the most informed perspective on what it was that was happening. And that's because one of the things that we see as third-party researchers is we can gauge the health of the system, meaning we can see where content emerges in like a very small coordinated group of people, and then we can watch it percolate, and so we actually watch it spread. We watch the content get written and posted to these really dicey blogs. We watch it hit Facebook and certain small groups. We watch the specific requests that it be coordinated and shared out. We see it happening in Twitter, in secret Twitter chat groups. We see it happening on Discord, on Twitch, on 4chan, you name it. So we have this kind of top-line perspective that lets us track content as it percolates from platform to platform, whereas the platform's job is to understand what's happening kind of in its own house. And particularly back in 2016, before the problem was recognized as widely systemic, there were not a whole lot of people who were sitting in the tech platforms thinking, how is Russian intelligence misusing my platform today? So what happened with Russia was, you know, we live in an age where societal divisions are high, and you know, you've probably heard about the two Americas. Social networks show us what we want to see, and so there's an idea that the two Americas actually consume very different types of content. Sam alluded to this when he was talking about information omnivores. Most often people will see content from one particular you know, blue content or red content, since we're talking about the US here. The problem with seeing only blue content or red content is it reinforces a particular point of view, makes you think that everybody kind of thinks the way that you are. Since you are sort of constantly seeing that reinforced content and that reinforced perspective, your guard is down a little bit. And so, especially when it's a friend or someone that you know or trust who's doing the sharing, you don't think Jane is trying to manipulate me by sharing this article from some blog I've never heard of. Instead, you're sort of you're already in an environment of you know, believing good things both about the sharer, and then when the share happens to reinforce your perspective, you're just much more inclined to kind of readily accept it. So social networks were designed to show people what makes them feel happy and engaged, and so it's very rare in a platform that's goal is to make you happy and engaged for them to voluntarily interject. You know, me, I have a slightly left of center feed most of the time. It would be a little bit incongruous for me to suddenly start seeing Fox and Friends video clips stuck in there. So the downside is that the division and the disparity in what we see kind of perpetuates and even increases the idea of the kind of two siloed separate Americas. And what that does is that really opens the door for disinformation campaigns and propagandists to produce content that looks just plausible enough that we don't stop and think about it. And so the Russia pages, we saw two things in particular. You know, the names, some of the pages were things like Blacktivist, and that was a you know, largely plausible Black Lives Matter type page that was just a little bit extreme. And then it got progressively more and more extreme. But in the early days when people were just starting to follow it, particularly when they were paying for ads to grow their page numbers, it was just a little tiny bit, you know, it was maybe your point of view on the issue, but just a little bit out there. So just widening the Overton window just that much. And we saw this with all of the pages. They all had very similar things. The ad would be relatively innocuous. Army of Jesus, I think, was the name of the page that posted this one. The early Army of Jesus posts were much more just sort of like a Christianish Facebook page, and then all of a sudden you go in and you watch the content evolve, and you have Hillary boxing Jesus, and then there's also a couple of like you know, not today Satan, sort of, you know, like if you want if you want Jesus to win, I think was actually the caption on the banner on top of this. And so, of course, if you want Jesus to win, what you've done by liking it is you've communicated signal back that you're receptive to this type of content. So that's what the platform sees, and they don't really know that it's a propagandist content. They just know that you've liked something on the page. So you're going to see more of it. You're informing the recommender system. And then the other thing is, when you like something or take an action, that action is transmitted to your friends. Oftentimes, not all of the time, but some percentage of the time, what you do on the platform is communicated to people who might find it interesting. So the challenge of like if you want Jesus to win is that you are kind of perpetuating the spread of the propaganda. So the Russia-linked accounts, they bought political ads that focused on social issues. Never for a candidate, always for a social issue. This, of course, is sort of tacitly against a candidate. Well, it's in fact quite clearly against a candidate, if we're being perfectly honest. But what we have here is most of the focus: Blacktivist, Army of Jesus, Secured Borders, Defend the Second, these are the names of some of the pages, was really to continue to facilitate division. And they actually did this in the real world too. So it's not just the ads and the pages and the content. They were actually creating events that were getting people to show up in real life. So there was a situation in Texas where they had a Texas secessionist group, I believe was, they had a couple Texas groups, but they had a Texas secessionist group, and then they had a pro-Islam Texas page. So they weren't just targeting the right or the left. They were in fact targeting any type of divisive issue they could. And they held rallies on the same day. They invited the Texas secessionists to rally for secession or gun rights or something, and then they invited the Muslims to come and defend Islamic heritage to the same location, same place, same time. And so this is how these things jump out of the real world. And if you want to really get into all of the tactics that they got into, the Mueller indictment against the Russian parties is pretty incredible. So the other strategy was to create hundreds of fake accounts that linked back to their own websites. And this is where, again, the content that you look at on the internet does in fact send signal back to inform recommender systems and to inform ads and other things about what you are interested in. So we can't conclusively say that Russian disinformation campaign changed the election. We have no idea. It's really hard to gauge output. The information is so fragmented. But what we can say is that it has had a phenomenal impact on our conversation, on our society, in the sense that it's decreased trust, it's increased societal fractures, and hopefully the good that will come out of it is people will be more informed as we move into 2018. We're in 2018 as we move into the elections. Unless you think that just because the social platforms know that it's going on, that means it's fixed. That's not quite where we are yet. The Roy Moore campaign in Alabama, so one of the things that researchers were looking at was the notion of perhaps, how many of you heard the narrative that Roy Moore's accusers were paid? How many of you guys paid attention to the Alabama special election? Yeah. How many of you heard that Roy Moore's accusers were paid? Yeah, so there was an interesting Twitter account called Umpire43. And one day that Twitter account it tweeted that its wife had special inside information. The bio on the Twitter account said that this was a former Navy SEAL and a former signals intelligence specialist and so on and so forth. That had this very unimpeachable military type persona was behind this particular fake person. This was a fake person. And this fellow tweeted that his wife had received information from her friend that Roy Moore's accusers were paid $1,000 with the $ at the end. And so, So there's certain really interesting things that we start to see with like Russian keyboards don't have commas, I'm sorry, apostrophes, because the possessive case doesn't use an apostrophe. So and the $ at the end is another sort of notorious signal that this is not an American, certainly not an American serviceman, would probably not make that mistake. So this is the examples of the kind of signals that we look to pick up. We of course then see when we go look at Umpire 43 how many times that account's stuff has made it into Red State blog and a couple of the other sort of less diligent about fact-checking right-wing blogs. And so that particular fake account's materials were amplified, the posts that this particular fake account was making were amplified to people who then went and read those blogs as well, and he was posted in there, as an authoritative source, as opposed to a troll from God knows where. It's also really hard to conclusively say Russia, even though this is where we are. So the goal of all of this is really to create a sense. Oh, and by the way, Umpire 43 was because in 2012 the account was a baseball bot. So we went way far back in time to look at what this account had been doing over the prior 6 years, and found that in 2012 it just tweeted baseball stats, and it was a completely automated account that had probably been bought and sold, and that is how fake accounts are transacted, and that is why. When I get into the what to do, really understanding who is behind the message is so critical. So the goal of a lot of these efforts is to create doubt and disillusionment. It's to make you feel that it is just way too hard to tell what's true and what's not true. That it in some ways actually reinforces that what you see from your friends is going to be the thing that you pay the most attention to, even if your friends aren't necessarily going out there and sharing the most fact-check stuff. So 2 things you can do. The first is really investigate the narrative, since we are, since a lot of people do feel just absolutely burdened by trying to figure out what is and isn't a real source, and since they take so much of their information from their friends, it's really important to pay attention to what you're sharing. Are you kind of a good citizen in your friend group? Do you fact check your sources, or do you just say, well, this headline made me feel a certain way, and so I'm going to reshare it so that other people feel that same sense of righteous outrage? So actually going and taking the time to do the fact check, a lot of the platforms will probably talk about their fact checking efforts. But so that is where we are. Anyone can get taken in by a story that confirms their biases. It's not a partisan issue at all. It's just human nature. And then the second thing is really to investigate the speaker. So there are a lot of fake accounts on social media, and particularly if you hang out on pages or groups on Facebook, they try their best to kind of keep their garden clean, but fake accounts do still pop up. Twitter in particular, which doesn't have a problem with anonymity. That also trying to get a sense of like who is talking, why has this been shared hundreds of thousands of times. Really looking to see if you're engaging with somebody deeply, is the narrative authentic, and if this is a person I don't know, inviting me to an event in my community that sounds potentially incendiary, who is this? Just take the extra time to check. So what we have, kind of our best defense against bots and disinformation campaigns isn't a password or a firewall. It's us, it's community, it's being stronger and more adaptable, understanding that this is where the information ecosystem is. And there are a lot of positive things that the platforms are doing to try to fix it. There are a lot of very positive things that regulators are doing to try to ensure that that happens. But right now where we are is the best thing to do is to call out false narratives within our community and really press for facts. And above all, we have to have the courage to unflinchingly pursue the truth, even when it leads us to confront our own biases or have uncomfortable conversations. So thank you.
My plan here is to try to get a question to each of our speakers. So the first one I'm going to start off with is for Renee. Renee, what do you say when people say Snopes or other fact-checking sites are partisan?
I mean, I think it's ridiculous. Am I allowed to say that? I just do. I think it's ridiculous. I think it's a cop-out, candidly. I think that there are, fake news was never about what you agree with or don't agree with. It was supposed to be about the original use of the term was really to refer to information that was inauthentic. And so you can read a Snopes fact check and decide that you still don't like Hillary Clinton, but acknowledge that Pizzagate is probably not the reason to justify your dislike of Hillary Clinton. And so that is, so in my opinion, I think that that's just a real cop-out, and I think that people who say that are people who are locked into a partisan mindset, and just, if you don't want to read it on Snopes, go read it on PolitiFact.
Sure. Sure, and if you were to say that about Snopes, I would say to you that their chief of marketing is a former Army member, and that they have various people from various political parties that work for them. So they are kind of unimpeachable in some ways.
You're watching MCTV, Millbrae Community Television.